Among the many interesting aspects of Böcklin's life is how deeply he was rooted in the Basel art scene. He was close friends with the famous art historian Jakob Burckhardt. Jakob Burckhardt himself had actually basically invented the subject of art history and became a famous art critic and art historian of the Renaissance. Jakob Burckhardt made the mistake to criticize Arnold Böcklin prior to the execution of frescoes for the old museum at Augustinergasse. And Böcklin was clearly not prepared to take the criticism. So he ended the friendship, and in the year later, he actually executed these several humoristic mascarons for the garden facade here at the Kunsthalle in Basel. And people familiar with the art scene recognized a strange resemblance in these rather irreverent, satirical faces, as in this instance, and the famous art historian Jakob Burckhardt. So maybe that was Böcklin's way to get back at the famous art historian. When you now look at this portrait, this very conventional portrait of Jakob Burckhardt executed by Arthur Volkmann, you'll see that this is also, although it's completely serious, not without a humoristic effect, although unintended, of course. Because the way he shows this man clad in an ancient, toga-style cloak, and this receding head, almost like Caesar or something, this gives it also like an undercurrent of irony, but again, not intentional. What's nice in this juxtaposition of works from our collection is that here you see this totally stiff but also totally appropriate portrait executed by Arthur Volkmann of the famous art historian Jakob Burckhardt. And then next to it you see this intentionally humorous, satirical it's not exactly a portrait, but take on Jakob Burckhardt's personality by Böcklin. And then you get this background of these two quarreling, and you can imagine a time where they were center figures in the Basel art life, and you just wish you could have been part of that and see them in action, like these two grand figures of late 19th century artistic life in this city. Literature and art have long enjoyed the closest relationship. This dates back even to antiquity. If you think back to the constellations where we saw two artists drawing from Ovid or from Homer, you'll see that this was already part of a well-established culture, that painters drew from literary sources. In the 19th century, though, this basically received something like a boost, or there was a real innovative quality in drawing from more modern literary sources. For example, Shakespeare's plays, which had become disseminated throughout the German-speaking lands in the 18th century. Joseph Anton Koch was an Austrian painter who was based in Rome, and there he had gathered an entire circle of artists from the German-speaking lands around him, and they all were interested in the Italian Renaissance as their main source of inspiration. For example, here you can see how Joseph Anton Koch paints this important scene where Macbeth and his friend Banquo encounter the three weird sisters. So these witches who basically give them this self-fulfilling prophecy. And in how he depicts them, you can see the heavy influence of Michelangelo from the Sistine Chapel. In a very romantic fashion, and typical for the Romantic era, you see that the entire background basically is devoted to enhance what's happening in the foreground. So nature basically reflects the emotional content of the work. So this is a tempestuous work, because it's a tempestuous moment. And the same thing happens with Böcklin when he paints the life of the great Renaissance poet Petrarch. Now you'll say, well, that's not literature. But of course it is, because Petrarch himself wrote down his life, and by doing that, his life became the stuff of legend. And painting Petrarch here, Böcklin shows the famous poet at the source of his inspiration and in quite a literal sense, because this is the Fontaine de Vaucluse in Provence in France, where the poet sings to his beloved Laura, who inspired him for his great love poetry. Basically, all sorts of love poetry that you today take as a given has its source in this famous sonnet that Petrarch wrote about Laura at the Fontaine de Vaucluse. And similar to what Joseph Anton Koch did here, but of course in an entirely different emotional setting, you see how, again, nature basically reflects the mood of the work. So this is something that's cave-like, that's well protected, where nature gives shelter to the human spirit and the inspiration of the poet. Arnold Böcklin for a while was part of this aforementioned German-Roman circle gathered around the Austrian painter Joseph Anton Koch in Rome. And there he met Anselm Feuerbach and Hans von Marais. And here we are comparing these three works by Böcklin, by Hans von Marais, and in this instance Anselm Feuerbach, because they, at one point or another, painted young children in their works. Here you see that Anselm Feuerbach chooses this very austere approach, and his antiquicizing figure of the mother looking down at her child is filled with tenderness, but also there is the severe quality. And she almost looks like an ancient goddess, although it is supposedly a scene taken from real life somewhere at the border of Antiquity. The relationship here is one of closeness, as indicated by the downward gaze, but also of distance. And as you can see, the sky basically is the backdrop, and our gaze has to travel upwards to really see the entire figure in this surprisingly large format. So, juxtaposing this work that is, you could say, antique in spirit, we chose Hans von Marais' work, which is almost completely sketchy. Hans von Marais here also paints a young child, and he even gives a title, just the child. So this is what it's really about, this whole work. And the child is surrounded by towering figures by comparison. So these clad in antique togas, and then two horses, and the child itself sits on the ground, rather attentive, its gaze directed toward the viewer in a rather adult posture. And the most interesting aspect of this whole work is not just how the child is painted, but also the entire surface, that you can see the individual brush strokes, that it's very sketch-like in character, which is, again, very, you could almost say, somber in mood, very dark, subdued colors, similar to the ones that Anselm Feuerbach also used. And then you get this third way of painting children in the span of about 10 to 20 years, where Arnold Böcklin has decisively entered his symbolist phase. And he gives us the image of the young child as the beginning of life. In his whole composition, he basically draws from a subject, an allegorical subject, called the staircase of life, that had been around for a while in art history. And usually you would expect to find a proper staircase, and then people positioned there according to their age. First they ascend the staircase, and then they descend, and at the end, of course, they die. So you gather strength, and then you lose it, and then you're dead. So that's basically the idea of this subject. And Böcklin turns it into, well, it has an idiosyncratic twist, starting with the children here, then moving on to basically man and woman in their prime, and it ends on top in this case. So we follow the gaze upward. That's the itinerary of life, starting from young age to death, and there, as a symbol of death, you see the skeleton about to strike out at an old seated man. The colors here are vivid, they are intense, and one of the most maybe beautiful aspects of this whole work is this small rivulet of a river and the single floating flower here.